Just over a year ago, I did a series of videos on Roland Barthes' book Mythologies, and then I kind of got sidetracked and never finished it. So I thought, well, let's finish it up. I think I have about 2 videos left to do. So in these last videos, we're going to look at the end of Barthes' book Mythologies. It's a really interesting section in which he kind of goes from the specific examples of the first half to more literary theory, you might say, and also some Marxist theory as well. We're not going to agree, of course, with everything he says, but it is an interesting read nevertheless. So I have this big box here, and you might be wondering what this is all about. Well, this image does appear a little bit fleshed out in the book itself, so let's fill it in and pick up our story from this point on. Now, what Barthes has said up to now is that there is, in sign theory, typically a signifier, right? So a signifier, there we go. And then we also have a signified, so a signified. And the classic example is something like tree. We have the sound tree, there we go. And then we have some kind of image in our mind, right? So there is our tree. And together these two things form a sign. So this is all on the level of language. If we put these things together, we have a sign, and there's nothing too extraordinary about this. But then, according to Barthes, we need to move on to the level of myth. And so we take this first sign and we turn it into a bigger sign. And this has a number of layers as well. So we turn this sign into a signifier. Okay, and that can be the tree. Can also be something like a black soldier giving a salute, and we saw this before in previous videos. So this image then becomes a sign that's going to signify something more mythical. It's going to have a larger meaning. And this larger meaning then is the new signified. So the new signified, okay. In the case of the black soldier giving the salute, this could be something like imperialism. So imperialism, being nationalistic, that kind of thing. And then these two things together, these form, on the third level, a new sign. And in a sense, we just basically have two signs, right? We have the first level sign, which has to do with language. We say a black soldier giving a salute. We imagine it in our minds. That's sign number one. And then this sign becomes a bigger sign of something else, which in this case might be imperialism. Now, as Barthes talks about this, he attaches some other words to these ideas. So first of all, the signifier here, he refers to as the meaning. And in any kind of mythical symbolism, the signifier often has a very rich meaning. So you could think of that black soldier having a family, having a history. This is the gritty level of the everyday. And that's the meaning of that signifier. But then the signifier tends to also empty out. And so Barthes talks about a form. In a previous video, we talked a little bit about how you can imagine this as a vase with, a flower in it. There we go. I probably drew this more nicely in my previous video, but anyways. So the container here is like the form. It can be transparent. You're not paying much attention to it, but it's holding something else. And in the same way, the signifier, as it becomes a form, becomes the container for something else, which is the signified, and that Barthes calls the concept. So that's the concept, which in this case is imperialism. Now, the interesting thing here is that in mythology, there are relatively few concepts, but there are many different forms. Okay, so if we think of imperialism or nationalism, we can think of a whole bunch of different examples. Let's say a flag, or perhaps somebody treasuring a war medal, and the list goes on. Now, as we also talked about in a previous video, it can be very difficult to find the right word to capture what this concept is. And so Barthes suggests that often we need to create neologisms, made up words, neologisms, in order to kind of get a sense of the whole concept, everything associated with it, everything it conjures up. And he gives some examples of this as well. So, for instance, he says, imagine that you see some houses from the Basque country, right, in Spain, and then you go back to Paris, and you see a kind of caricature of that architecture almost as you come home. You know you're dealing with a reduced concept, with some kind of stereotype of what Basque architecture looks like. And so let's refer to this as Basquity. Basquity, there we go. This style of kind of imitation architecture, we need to give it some kind of name, right? And that's often what the analyst will have to do. Okay, so at this point then we see that we have these two levels of meaning, and this is why myth, according to Barthes, is a second-order semiological system, right? It's the second level. It's a meta-language. It's a language about another language. The next thing that we can talk about here is how, as Barthes deepens the discussion, he uses a whole bunch of metaphors or descriptions to talk about how we move from the signifier to the signified at the level of myth. So I'll kind of write these down here. The first one is the image of the turnstile, and you can imagine as you go through a turnstile at the metro, let's say, at one point you're on one side, and at the other moment you're on the other side. In the same way, with the signifier and the signified, we're constantly going back and forth between these two things. At the one level, the black soldier is just a black soldier giving a salute, and at the other level, it's a symbol of imperialism, and we constantly kind of flip back and forth between these two meanings. It's an ever-turning turnstile, you might say. We can also say that in this process, there's always distortion. Okay, there's always distortion. We lose something. There's a sense in which the whole process leaves the first signifier impoverished. And often with myth, we are dealing with caricatures, with pastiche, with symbols, with stereotypes. So for Barthes, there's something almost dishonest about this, and something is definitely lost. Another phrase he tends to use, not only in the second part, but also earlier, is to talk about a crime scene, and an alibi. So, you know, from watching, shows about cops and so on, that often people have an alibi. They say, well, I was somewhere else, right? I was at the bar and these friends are willing to vouch for me. So it couldn't have been me at the crime scene. And this is a little bit similar to the signifier and the signified. So the alibi is this other meaning, the mythical meaning, right? But whereas with a crime scene, eventually you figure out whether the person really has an alibi or not. In this case, it's forever kind of ambiguous. Does the signifier really connect with the signified, right? How do these two things relate? We can never quite decide for ourselves what the truth is in this relationship. Another interesting metaphor that's used is the window pane. The window pane. So imagine that you're on the train, let's say, and you're going places. Just as we talked before about the form being empty, so the pane itself is kind of transparent, and you're seeing through it, and then you see meaning beyond it, right? And again, we're kind of framing that meaning, interpreting it, and providing some kind of mythical understanding of it. Here's another one that Barthes talks about. He refers to the second meaning, the signified, as stolen speech. He also uses the term robbery. He's quite negative about it. And then he says all of this tends to confront us. So when you see these caricatures, these myths, they kind of stop you. And it's as if they talk to you, and ideology confronts you. You have to make a decision about this. Are you going to accept it? Does this make sense to you? Or do you potentially see some problems with it? Then one more here. This is the idea that all of this is what he calls motivated speech. motivated speech. And this is an interesting idea because he's suggesting that whereas the original signifier and signified are kind of arbitrary, so I could have used any word for tree, could have called it a kabooble or something like that. When it comes to this second level of meaning, we can't just use any signifier to signify something like imperialism. Not everything is going to do, right? Like if that soldier was just drinking a Coke or something like that, we could say, well, is that really going to work to signify imperialism? So, in other words, motivated speech is less arbitrary. It's more driven. It's motivated to give a particular message, and there has to be some kind of analogy between meaning and form. These things have to connect with each other. We can't just use any particular symbol. And in that sense, these kinds of myths tend to be similar to ideographs. So an ideograph or an ideograph, or however you pronounce that, is a kind of word picture, right? It looks like a picture, and yet it's a word at the same time. So it's less arbitrary and more symbolic. All right. Now, there are some things, according to Barthes, that resist myth. So myth tries to conquer everything. It tries to dominate everything, right? But there are a few things that do try to resist it. So one of these things is disorder. Like, let's say I have a whole bunch of objects and they seem kind of random, and I'm just having them all in a pile. How can we turn them into a myth? Well, what we can do is we can say, well, this is surrealistic, right? Or surreal is the word, not surrealistic. So we can use this as an example of surrealism or theater of the absurd or anything like that. And we turn disorder into some kind of meaning, into some kind of larger myth. Another interesting one here is math. You might recall that earlier in the book, he talks about Einstein, the brain of Einstein, and what this represents. Well, math is so abstract that it's hard to turn it into a myth, but we can take all of math, right, the whole thing, and say, well, all of that represents some kind of clarity, some kind of abstract thought. And we see that, for instance, in certain mathematical formulas that become very famous. If we talk about E equals mc squared, we can say, okay, well, that is a pure signifier. In other words, it really signifies that all of math is about abstract thought. So we don't have all kinds of individual myths, individual signifiers. There's just one big picture here. And that's also what he says about Einstein's brain, right? It's hard for us to make sense of the specific calculations that Einstein does. So we're just going to talk about him as a figure for genius as a whole. There's resistance there to myth, but myth tries to overcome it. Another interesting one here is poetry. So poetry tries to get back to the signifier. And if you've read a lot of contemporary poetry, you know that this would be true. The sense of dwelling on the word, zooming in, not trying to give some kind of larger message or meaning necessarily, but really dwelling on the specific word and how it brings us back to reality, trying to focus on meaning especially. Another way in which we can resist myth potentially is to turn myth into myth. So if we have, here we go, to turn myth into myth, if we have a story, if we have a myth, then rather than to kind of unpack it and to suggest that it gets us back to reality or to believe it even, instead what we do is we basically say, you know what, we're just going to focus on the myth itself and enjoy the myth and say, hey, it is a myth. And that way you can't fool us with it. Now, this summarizes a lot of postmodern literature. If you read somebody like Michael Ondaatje or some of the magical realists, right, they so focus on myth itself to kind of say, well, you're not going to be fooled as a reader. Everything is a story. Everything is a myth. So in this way, we overcome the ideology behind myth because we know it's just a story. And that's why so many postmodern books constantly remind you, kind of to a tedious extent, to say it's just a story, right? Don't forget it. All right, so at this point then, we've dug into the text a little bit more. And the last thing I want to mention is that if we look at all of this together, then there are three ways in which we can read these myths. First of all, we can approach this from the perspective of the propagandist. So the propagandist is the person who makes the myth. That person tends to start with the concept. Okay, so the propagandist says to himself, I'm going to make up a myth. I'm going to start with an idea, and then I'll find some kind of symbol or form for it. We also have the skeptic, also referred to as the mythologist, and this is the person who's very doubtful and who kind of says, you know what, I think all of this is a disguise, it's a distortion, and so we need to go back to the signifier. Let's focus on that, and let's see how we can decipher what's ultimately behind the myth. And then finally, we have on the third level, the believer. The believer looks at the sign as a whole, consumes it, there's a kind of capitalist metaphor there, consumes it, believes it, and doesn't distinguish clearly between signifier and signified. I think these levels themselves are a little bit simplistic because most of us are probably moving back and forth between multiple levels, but it definitely does help us to make sense of how different people react to these levels of myth. Okay, so that brings this video to an end, and in the last one, I'm going to talk a bit more about politics, how all of this relates to Marxism, as well as a few other things. Thanks for listening.